The year was 1307, and the most powerful military order in Christendom was about to vanish in a single night. Not through battlefield defeat or papal decree, but through something far more sinister. A coordinated strike that would make the arrest of the Knights Templar the most controversial legal proceeding in medieval history. Picture this. Dawn breaks over Paris on Friday, October 13th. Mist clings to the cobblestones as royal guards move through the shadows, sealed orders clutched in their hands. In monasteries, commanderies, and fortress walls across France, Templar knights rise for morning prayers, unaware that by sunset their world will cease to exist. They had survived the Crusades, built banking empires, and commanded respect from kings and popes alike. But they had not survived King Philip IV. What you're about to discover isn't just the story of a trial. It's the blueprint for how power destroys inconvenient truths, how accusations become evidence, how torture becomes testimony, and how the most elite fighting force of the medieval world was systematically dismantled through legal proceedings that would make even modern prosecutors uncomfortable. Because here's what they don't teach you in history class. The trial of the Templars wasn't about justice, it was about elimination. And the methods used were so effective, so ruthlessly coordinated, that they would echo through centuries of political persecution that followed. But to understand how an entire order disappeared overnight, you need to see the trap being set years before that fateful Friday. You need to follow the money, the politics, and the carefully orchestrated campaign that turned heroes into heretics with nothing more than parchment and pain. So settle in, because we're about to dive into the most consequential legal destruction in European history. A trial that would redefine the relationship between church and state, reshape the map of medieval power, and leave questions that historians are still trying to answer 700 years later. The Knights Templar didn't just fall, they were pushed. And the man holding the blade was the most ruthless monarch of his generation. Philip IV wasn't born to destroy the Templars, but by 1307 he needed them gone more than he needed his next breath. France was drowning in debt. The royal treasury had been bled dry by constant warfare with England, Flanders, and anyone else who dared challenge French supremacy. Philip had already expelled the Jews, seizing their assets. He had debased the currency so many times that merchants refused to accept French coins. He had even kidnapped the Pope, dragging Boniface VIII from his palace in a scandal that shocked all of Europe. But none of it was enough. The crown needed money, and the Templars had it. Lots of it. Here's what made the Templars so dangerously wealthy. They weren't just knights. They were Europe's first international banking network. While other orders focused on prayer and warfare, the Templars had built something unprecedented. A financial empire that stretched from London to Jerusalem, processing payments, loans, and deposits for everyone from peasants to kings. Their Paris temple wasn't just a fortress, it was the medieval equivalent of Fort Knox, and Philip owed them everything. The crown's debts to the Templars were so massive that repayment would have bankrupted France. Worse, the Templars held detailed records of every transaction, every loan, every embarrassing financial arrangement the monarchy had made. They knew where the bodies were buried, so to speak. But debt alone wasn't enough to justify what Philip had planned. He needed a different kind of weapon. He needed scandal. He needed heresy. He needed the French people to demand the Templars' destruction. Enter Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's chief minister and the most brilliant legal mind of his generation. Nogaret understood something that modern prosecutors would recognize immediately. Public opinion matters more than evidence. Control the narrative, and you control the verdict. Nogaret began his campaign years before the arrests. Whispers started circulating in Paris about strange Templar rituals. Stories spread through taverns and markets about initiation ceremonies involving blasphemy, idol worship, and acts too shocking to speak aloud. These weren't random rumors. They were carefully planted seeds designed to grow into public outrage. The genius of Nogaret's strategy was its simplicity. The Templars were secretive by nature. Their initiation ceremonies were private. Their meetings were closed. Their financial dealings were confidential. All Nogaret had to do was suggest that secrecy equaled guilt and let human imagination fill in the blanks. But whispers weren't enough. Nogaret needed witnesses. He needed confessions. He needed legal justification for what was essentially grand theft on a national scale. So he found Esquin de Floyrant, a disgraced former Templar with a grudge and a willingness to say anything for the right price. Floyrant approached King Philip with tales of Templar corruption so lurid they would make a tabloid editor blush. Denial of Christ, worship of mysterious heads, ritual homosexuality, spitting on the cross during initiation. The accusations were perfectly crafted to outrage medieval Christian sensibilities while remaining vague enough to be impossible to disprove. Philip pretended to be shocked. He consulted with legal experts who confirmed that such charges, if proven, would justify the complete dissolution of the order. He wrote letters to other European monarchs, warning them of the Templar threat. He even sent emissaries to the Pope, demanding immediate action against these dangerous heretics. But privately, Philip was already planning their destruction. Throughout the summer of 1307, sealed orders were distributed to royal officers across France. The instructions were precise, coordinated, and absolutely secret. On Friday, October 13th, at dawn, every Templar property in France would be simultaneously raided. Every knight, sergeant, and chaplain would be arrested. Every document, treasure, and asset would be seized in the name of the crown. The operation required military precision. Over 2,000 Templars lived in France, spread across dozens of commanderies, preceptories, and urban houses. Missing even one would allow word to spread, giving other Templars time to flee or hide their assets. Philip's officers had a single morning to capture an entire military order, and they succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. By sunset on October 13th, virtually every Templar in France was in royal custody. Their properties were under guard, their treasures inventoried, their records secured. The most powerful military order in Christendom had been neutralized without a single sword being drawn. But arrests were only the beginning. Now came the real challenge. Philip had to prove his accusations in court, extract confessions from trained warriors, and convince the Church to dissolve an order it had created and protected for 2 centuries. The trial that would follow would redefine medieval justice, introduce interrogation techniques that wouldn't look out of place in a modern thriller, and ultimately determine whether the law served truth or power. What happened next would shock even hardened medieval observers, because Philip's legal team had crafted something unprecedented in Christian jurisprudence. A judicial machine designed not to discover truth, but to manufacture it. The interrogations began within days of the arrests. But these weren't the formal proceedings you might expect from medieval courts. Instead, Philip's investigators employed techniques that would later be refined during the Spanish Inquisition. Sleep deprivation, prolonged standing, psychological pressure. And when those failed, physical torture that left no permanent marks but broke even the strongest wills. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master himself, was among the first to crack. Under relentless questioning, the man who had led the Templars through their final campaigns in the Holy Land confessed to denying Christ during his initiation decades earlier. He admitted to spitting on the cross. He acknowledged that such practices were common throughout the order. But here's what makes de Molay's confession so revealing. He wasn't tortured into submission. Not initially. Instead, Philip's investigators used a more subtle approach. They convinced him that cooperation would save his brothers from harsher treatment. They promised that confession would lead to reconciliation with the church, not destruction. They made him believe that admitting to minor heresies would prevent charges of major ones. It was psychological manipulation of the highest order, and it worked. Within weeks, confessions were pouring in from Templars across France. Knight after knight admitted to the same charges: denial of Christ, obscene kisses during initiation, worship of a mysterious bearded head they called Baphomet. The testimonies were remarkably consistent, which Philip's lawyers claimed proved their validity. Modern historians see something different in that consistency. The confessions were too similar, too perfectly aligned with the original accusations. They read like scripts, not spontaneous admissions of guilt, which suggests that Philip's interrogators weren't just extracting truth, they were dictating it. But the real genius of Philip's legal strategy wasn't in the confessions themselves, it was in how he used them. Rather than presenting the Templars as a few bad knights who had lost their way, Philip painted the entire order as systematically corrupt. He argued that the heresies weren't aberrations, but institutional practices passed down from master to initiate across generations. This wasn't just about individual guilt. It was about organizational conspiracy. And under medieval law, that changed everything. If the order itself was heretical, then every member was guilty by association. Every asset was tainted by corruption. Every privilege could be revoked without appeal. The Pope, Clement V, found himself in an impossible position. Technically, the Templars answered directly to him, not to any secular authority. Philip had no legal right to arrest them, interrogate them, or seize their property. But by the time Clement learned of the arrests, it was too late to stop them. The confessions were already spreading across Europe, creating a scandal that threatened to engulf the entire church. Clement's response reveals the political realities of medieval power. Rather than condemn Philip's actions, he issued a papal bull authorizing other European monarchs to arrest Templars in their territories. He couldn't appear to be protecting heretics, even if he suspected the charges were fabricated. The church's credibility depended on being seen as the defender of orthodoxy, not the protector of corruption. But other European rulers weren't as enthusiastic about Philip's methods as he had hoped. Edward II of England initially refused to act against the Templars, declaring that he found the charges impossible to believe. The German princes largely ignored papal instructions. Even in Spain, where the Reconquista had made military orders essential to royal power, arrests were limited and half-hearted. This created a new problem for Philip. His case depended on portraying Templar corruption as universal, not specifically French. If other kingdoms found no evidence of heresy, it would suggest that Philip's confessions were unreliable. Worse, it might encourage Templars to flee France, taking their knowledge of royal finances with them. So Philip escalated. He pressured Clement to establish a formal papal commission to investigate the order's practices. He demanded that captured Templars be turned over to ecclesiastical authorities for proper trial. He even suggested that the Pope convene a general council to determine the order's fate once and for all. Each move was calculated to increase pressure while maintaining legal legitimacy. Philip understood that medieval justice was as much about procedure as evidence. If he could force the church to validate his accusations through proper channels, the Templars' guilt would become official doctrine, immune from later challenge. The commission that finally convened in 1309 was a masterpiece of judicial theatre. Presided over by church officials, but guided by royal lawyers, it heard testimony from hundreds of witnesses. Former Templars, disgruntled servants, local clergy, even random citizens with grievances against the order. The proceedings dragged on for months, generating thousands of pages of depositions that seemed to confirm every accusation Philip had made. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. Several Templars recanted their confessions when given the chance to speak before church authorities. They claimed they had been tortured, threatened, or deceived into admitting crimes they never committed. Some provided detailed accounts of their interrogations that painted Philip's investigators as brutal and corrupt. Most damaging of all, Jacques de Molay himself attempted to withdraw his confession. Standing before the papal commissioners, the Grand Master declared that the Templars were innocent of all charges. He claimed his earlier admissions had been extracted through promises that were never fulfilled. He demanded the right to defend his order before the Pope personally. It was a moment that could have changed everything. If the Grand Master's retraction had been accepted, if the Commission had seriously investigated the torture allegations, if other European rulers had demanded proper evidence before accepting Philip's charges, the entire case might have collapsed. Instead, something far more sinister happened. The Templars who recanted their confessions began disappearing from their cells. Some were found dead, victims of mysterious accidents or sudden illnesses. Others simply vanished, never to be seen again. The message was clear. Cooperation meant survival. Resistance meant elimination. The trial of the Knights Templar wasn't just medieval history, it was a blueprint, a demonstration of how power can weaponize law, how accusations can become truth through repetition, and how even the mightiest institutions can be dismantled when politics demands their destruction. Philip IV got everything he wanted. The Templars' wealth filled his treasury. Their lands became royal property. Their banking network was absorbed by the crown. And their silence about his debts died with them in the flames that consumed Jacques de Molay and his remaining brothers in 1314. But Philip's victory came at a cost that echoes through history. He had shown that no institution, however powerful or sacred, was immune from political persecution. He had proven that torture could manufacture evidence, that procedure could substitute for proof, and that fear could silence truth. The methods Philip pioneered didn't die with the Templars. They were refined by inquisitors, adopted by dictators, and perfected by modern regimes that understood his fundamental insight. Control the narrative, manufacture the evidence, and eliminate the inconvenient. Justice becomes whatever those in power decide it should be. 700 years later, we're still living with the consequences of that Friday the 13th. Because when law serves power instead of truth, when accusations replace evidence, when silence is bought with violence, we all become Templars, standing in the dawn mist, unaware that our world is about to end. The only question is whether we'll recognize the trap before it's too late.